It is no secret that one of the main elements of Seed Destiny that many fans remember is its character arcs and controversial writing. That being said, the aforementioned topics of said anime are frequently plagued by fan complaints and criticism, with the character arcs of one of its main characters being the bane of the endless condemnation of the anime. This being in the form of Shinn Asuka, one of the main characters of Seed Destiny, and one of the, if not, most controversial main characters in all of anime history. In the beginning of the story, Shinn showed excellent promising characteristics of an active character, being different from his predecessors from the prequel anime. The character seemed promising to both viewers and fans alike, but ultimately, in the end, fans and viewers felt that Shinn was a wasted character due to the negligence of his character arc. But despite all the hate and slander, I genuinely believe that fans misinterpret Shinn Asuka and his character, as I think that he's actually quite an underrated underdog and one of the misunderstood characters of the anime itself. To begin this character analysis and dissection, if you will, I would like to first explain the interviews given to us by the directors of the anime on the theme and message that they wanted to portray and how it ultimately plays into Shinn's character. Head writer Chiaki Morosawa explained that one of the themes of the anime that was portrayed is about social literacy. It is the act of how multimedia and propaganda can control how people and the masses think. She explains that the anime is directed at children with this aforementioned message in mind, and how the youth of today will just follow what the media and internet tells them to be the truth, without ever thinking for themselves or finding the answer to see if it could be false or true. Because of the social information overload of the news and outlets and multimedia platforms, kids can't think for themselves, and that's what Morosawa was trying to convey in this anime. Shinn's character is the perfect representation of this. Throughout the anime, Shinn is portrayed as one of the characters that were vulnerable to the main antagonist's PR manipulation without ever questioning or even reflecting on the repercussions of his actions. In my eyes, I think Shinn represents the nature of youth today. We often want and wish for the power to do good and not to repeat the mistakes of yesterday, but in doing so, our naivety of youth leads to the manipulation of the media and government higher-ups. Now that I've explained my thesis statement and given you guys a rough idea of what Morosawa was thinking when she was writing Seed Destiny, next I would like to explain the character's point of views and his actions from how the anime and interviews of Morosawa portray his character. So I'm just going to make this really quick because I'm sure a lot of people have already seen Seed Destiny's first episode, but let me just explain my point of view of how I view the character. So, from the very first episode of Seed Destiny, Angry Eyes depicted a young Shinn and his family escape the first battle of Orb as seen in Gundam Seed. Amidst the chaos was the beam clash between the Calamity and Freedom's weapons that killed Shinn's family, leaving him to be an orphan due to the tragedy of war itself. And as Shinn cries and roars from the painful loss of his family, his anger and helplessness over the situation causes him to search for the power to protect others, and in doing so, prevent the fires of war from ever igniting again. The first episode does a spectacular job in cementing this as the event that invokes Shinn's drive for the rest of the show. It is this very event of sorrow that gives rise to Shinn's hatred and disdain for war and battles, and also being the main cause of his anger and behavior throughout the rest of the show. Now he's a soldier of Zaf. He fights for the main reason of preventing the people of today from going through what has experienced in the past. Shinn's anger issues and behavioral attitude have also been a characteristic that stands out, which causes conflict with the other characters of the anime. Primary example being the current orb leader, Kigali. So in the very first few episodes of Seed Destiny, Shinn blames Kigali and her family and their ideals of neutrality to be the main root correlating to Shinn's family being killed in Orb. He believes that the very ideals of Orb to remain neutral and pacifistic was weak and ineffective, which in turn is what allowed the Alliance to invade and burn down the nation in the first place. Because Shinn sees this pacifistic ideology as nothing more than a frail, baseless statement and a sign of weakness, it correlates directly to why Shinn believes in his own ideology of using force and power to fight in order to protect. Would this contrast the ideals of peace that Orb had in mind? One thing that I would like to address before going forward is that the many fan complaints of Shinn blaming Orb and his nation's ideals to be the cause of his family's death. So according to many fans, online posts and all that, they believe that Shinn is blaming the wrong people for his family's death, and instead he should be blaming the Earth Alliance for actually invading and attacking Orb in the first place. Well, the thing is, I can't understand why people would, think that way, but ultimately, imagine what would you do if you were in Shinn's shoes. The world itself is on the brink of a genocidal race war between two sides that refuse to accept the other. Your country decides to stay neutral and calms its own citizens by saying that by remaining pacifistic, the other nations won't attack at all. Your parents, who you trust for guidance as a kid, tells you that everything's going to be okay, and to believe in your country's ideals to the very end. Okay, so everyday life seems fine until one day your country actually gets attacked and everything basically goes to shit. Your parents blown up to pieces, your beloved sister destroyed by the blast. All that is left is just you, a lone survivor. So, who do you blame really? The nation attacking your home, or the lies fed to you from the very homeland you trusted to defend you and your family? You see, that's how Shinn sees the situation. And if I were in his position that day, I'm not gonna lie, I would be pissed too, and rightfully so. I mean, imagine if every word you believed in from government officials turned out to be nothing but an empty facade. Wouldn't you be pissed too that the nation that promised to protect you and your family by remaining neutral would ultimately fail in doing so? Of course, this event would all culminate into the Shinn we know of the beginning of the story. He's someone who has only known and wept because of his own powerlessness his whole life. And because of that, he would wish for the strength to do what he failed to do his whole life, the strength to protect. Due to the painful loss of his family, Shinn is always angry and in a pissed off mood, which causes him to be an almost antisocial like from everyone around him, evidently seen in the many episodes of the anime. From scriptwriter Morosawa's own words translated, in the very early stages of Seed, Kira had quite a few friends around him and was having a lot of fun. However, although Shinn has people around his age, he didn't have many friendships like Kira. This, of course, highlights one of the main differences between Shinn and his predecessor. If you guys remember in the beginning of Seed, Kira was a college student who was always friendly with those around him. He was a grade A student with a bright outlook on life and very easy to approach. While on the other hand, Shinn is rather hard to approach and has rough exterior, mainly due to the traumatic events that scarred his life. However, in certain episodes of Seed Destiny, we do find out that Shinn has some friends around his age on the Minerva. But the thing is, they aren't really like the friendships Kira had in the beginning of Seed. What I mean by this is that the friendships of Shinn and his crew isn't like the supporting type of vibe that Kira has with his friends. Kira's friends were always the main cause of why he fights aboard the Archangel. And occasionally, they do talk and try to relate to his situation as a pilot by raising his morale. Meanwhile, Shinn, he doesn't really have any of that. Sure, he talks to his friends and all, but none of them could ever understand Shinn's purpose and where he's coming from. No one around him really understands or can even relate to his grief over the loss of his family. This is evident even in early episodes, where Shinn is standing away and distant from his crew, and he often stays in his room reminiscing about his dead sister. What I'm trying to say is that Shinn really has no one to help him pull himself out of his past troubles. Despite popular belief, I do think that Shinn's supposedly best friends, Luna Maria and Ray, aren't really that good of friends to him. I mean, sure, they support him a lot physically, but in reality, they aren't really doing an excellent job at mentally aiding him. For example, every time Shinn has his angry temper tantrums, Luna Maria often chases after him to console him like a big sister would do to her younger brother. Although, to no one's surprise, this has little to no effect in calming his anger. I would like to note that in interviews and even in official character files, Luna Maria was also stated to have this big sisterly figure to the Minerva and is described by Morosawa as a bystander type. Although she is older than Shinn, she doesn't really have any qualities to remotely understand Shinn's point of view. Meanwhile, Ray, on the other hand, is like a hype man. He always supports Shinn's every decision and hypes him up, whether Shinn is in the wrong or not. Ray is written to be this character that deflects all sense of responsibility from Shinn's actions. Case in point, when Shinn was being rude to his superior officer, Athrun, when Shinn and Ray were discussing and planning how to defeat the Freedom, instead of telling Shinn to stop being rude, Ray just simply tells Athrun off and tells him he will have a talk with Shinn about his attitude later. Of course, this doesn't really happen at all, and Shinn continues to disrespect Athrun even after he shoots down the Freedom by rubbing it in his officer's face. In retrospect, Ray is ultimately this character that will always say yes to Shinn, meaning that as long as Ray is there to deflect responsibility by telling Shinn everything he does is right, Shinn will never think he is wrong, and ultimately won't ever reflect on his decisions as long as someone like Ray will always validate his comrade's every action by hyping him up. Speaking of friendships, I do think there was only one person in the Minerva that was ever capable of understanding Shinn's point of view, this being in the form of the Red Knight himself, Athrun Zala. Athrun's relationship with Shinn is perhaps the most complicated connection between two anime characters that I've ever seen. Athrun first met Shinn during the fall of Junior 7 aboard a ship of the Minerva, and they were fighting alongside each other in a battle against coordinator terrorists. To recall the events of the fall of Junior 7, it was a mission of Zaf to stop former coordinator pilots of the previous war from dropping a huge colony meteor by accelerating its trajectory towards Earth to cause disorderly chaos as a result of a hate crime. Zaf forces are meant to destroy or at least break the pieces of the giant colony to minimize damage to Earth and its cities near the equator. Although in the beginning there wasn't really much of a connection between the two, Athrun did leave a bit of an impression on a young Shinn with his excellent display of strength and unwavering bravery. Athrun's bravery was noticeable to both Shinn and even viewers when he specifically chose to stay back for the sake of continuing trying to split the colony into chunks despite the fact that retreat orders were already issued. Shinn even questioned why Athrun, out of all people, would stay back. Not only was he a civilian, but he was also from Orb of all things, choosing to risk his own life despite the consequences. Shinn, curious and even impressed by Athrun's willpower, he decides to stay back and risk his own life too alongside someone he has no connections with before. This whole episode is key to their relationship and is also one of Shinn's defining traits as a character. He often chooses to go out of his own way, out of his own free will, to help others. It is not until episode 16 of the anime when their relationship truly unfolds. Athrun, now readmitted into the army as an elite pilot of faith, acts as a commander to his subordinates and plans out operations as a result of his authority. Shinn, at first, is reluctant and feels mixed opinions on why someone like Athrun, who was only an Orb bodyguard beforehand, will be his superior officer. Of course, Shinn doesn't see Athrun for his own qualities, but rather someone who's affiliated and has ties with Orb, and because of this, Shinn is disobedient to his superior officer. It is almost as if Shinn views the entire situation as taking orders from someone who believed in Orb's ideals and has ties to his nations, two of the things Shinn dislikes the most. This is why Shinn feels the need to prove himself to his officer that he doesn't need someone like him, someone from Orb of all places, to tell him what to do on the battlefield. Of course, this is highlighted in the same episode I am talking about. Shinn decides to go after the commander of the enemy and even tries to take down a group of his oppressors alone in order to prove his strength for Athrun to see. What stands out the most in this episode is Shinn going berserk and destroying one of the Alliance's bases, and in doing so, frees captive slave workers that were oppressed by the troops of the Alliance. Of course, this goes against Athrun's orders, and instead of congratulating Shinn for freeing the captives and destroying the base, he berates his comrade for trying to play hero in the war. Now, this scene is quite debated a lot in online forums. Quite a number of fans believe that Athrun was being a douchebag about this whole situation and that Shinn was in the right for saving those people. Well, the thing is, I kinda agree with Athrun on this decision. When I was a kid and saw this scene for the first time, I always thought that what Shinn did was right. I would have done the same thing too, because it's what heroes do. I was shocked at Athrun for being on Shinn's case in this episode. Of course, what I'm referring to is that heroes, we save people. But after reflecting upon the words of Athrun in this episode, war is not something to play hero at. I realized that war isn't some kind of superhero gig where we're out there to save lives. It's not like a Kamen Rider or a Super Sentai show that was also airing concurrently during the same time as Destiny, where the MCs save lives. The responsibility of soldiers, according to Athrun, is to end the war as quickly as possible by following orders to the best of their abilities. And because of this scene not only challenges Shinn's choices, but also the children's views on war itself who were watching the anime at the time. While it's true that Shinn's good-natured actions have saved those people, he is still ultimately a soldier at the end of the day, not a hero. Shinn, of course, wants to be a hero type, and known as someone who saves people in order to not let what has happened to him in the past happen to others. This, of course, is implied in episode 18. Now, I won't go into much details as I did with the other segments, because this episode was purely action-based. Instead, I'll just focus on the banter between Shinn and Athrun. During the briefing room, Shinn was being a bit of a brat and defiant to Athrun. Athrun, instead, is rather patient with the young lad's tantrums and even encourages Shinn to be the main hitter of the operation to sneak in and destroy the Lohengrin cannon. In this scene, it is interpreted that Athrun was acting like a parent to a young child, in this case, Shinn, by using a kind and encouraging tone with uplifting words in order to motivate Shinn. During this whole episode, Shinn is pissed and even struggles in the cave with nothing to rely on but his data given to him by his superiors. After breaking in and decapitating the cannon, in doing so, also forces the Alliance to retreat and surrender. Shinn is congratulated by the townspeople for being the hero that saved the town. Of course, our hero is happy as seen from his facial expressions, and what surprised him the most was how Athrun even congratulated him by telling him that as long as he believed in himself and the orders provided to him, things will always work out. Shinn, of course, acts innocent with Athrun and jokes with him that he could have died if he was careless. If you guys remember, earlier I said that Athrun played the role of a parent in this episode, while Shinn played the role of a child. Think of it like this. When a child tries really hard at school to get good grades on their report card to please their parents, what is the first thing the child expects? Gratitude and praise is the answer to this. Shinn tried hard in this operation, and judging from his facial expressions at the end of the episode, he wanted to be praised more by Athrun, and even seemed like Shinn wanted Athrun to be on his side and see what he was doing was right. Shinn expects Athrun to support him and even depend on him like the Minerva crew does. Meanwhile, speaking of expectations, Athrun also has quite the high standards of what he wants Shinn to be. Athrun expects Shinn to be the best version of himself, an excellent soldier who will be Zaph's ace, his own image of a good-hearted warrior, not a destroyer. But of course, this doesn't play out as well as we think it does. Going back to the Junior 7 incident, if you guys remember, when Shinn saved the Athrun during their fall to orbit, Shinn is surprised that Athrun doesn't say thank you, which Athrun retorts by saying, well, what would you like me to say? With Shinn replying being, well, how about thanks for saving me, you bastard? This small conversation is how I would describe the relationship between the two. Both expect the other to do something that fits their expectations, but neither of them can really connect eye to eye and carry out said demands. Athrun could have been the very driving force that could have steered Shinn off his dark path during this second half, but due to complications this was impossible. Athrun, he's mostly stoic and never told Shinn his experiences in the past war to relate to him. What really sets them apart is due to Kira's interruptions of battles. Ever since Kira showed up on the battlefield with the Freedom Gundam, Athrun kept on doubting himself, and in doing so, most are on the ship. After his crippling defeat at the hands of the Freedom, Shinn loses complete respect for his commanding officer. In Shinn's eyes, he had just barely saved the Minerva from getting sunk, and even carried the team to victory. So why would he respect someone who ranked higher than him, that did nothing during the battle and instead moves around the ship, constantly questioning his purposes of why he fights? In Shinn's point of view, he's the ace that really saved everyone, not the supposed war hero who should have been the one to do so. Despite this, however, Shinn still cares for Athrun, even just a little bit. There's a scene in particular where Shinn talks to Athrun alone, mirroring their talk in episode 17, where instead Shinn motivates Athrun by telling him to get his shit together. Their relationship eventually does crumble after the impulse defeats the Freedom. Shinn, in a fit of rage, fights and destroys the Freedom, leaving Athrun to think that his best friend is dead. What Shinn fails to realize is that he had inadvertently hurt Athrun by shooting down Kira. Athrun's situation now mirrors how Shinn was when his family died in the Battle of Orb. Both are now someone who is powerless to stop their loved ones from getting hurt. But this time, the current Shinn himself is the one causing the pain. He is now seen as a destroyer, the very thing he swore not to become. In retrospect, although the anime portrays the two in a negative light, I very much think that Athrun and Shinn do care for each other, even if just a little bit. With Athrun often trying to talk to Shinn alone before battles, and Shinn trying to get Athrun out of his slump, an example I portrayed earlier. Although the two have
quite the expectations for each other, I do think that they can get quite along if it had not been for Kira's reintroduction into the story. Anyways, even when Shinn was ordered to shoot down Athrun in episode 36 to 37, Shinn even cries after supposedly killing Athrun, because ultimately, Athrun was his comrade too, someone he had connections with. Athrun wasn't the only one who Shinn had connections with. There was also another character who had connections with Shinn, and she was very integral to the MC's character development. This being in the form of Stella, an Alliance mobile suit pilot and enemy of Zao forces, is surprisingly the only character in the first half of the anime who truly mellows out Shinn's aggressive behavior. Even though the two didn't realize that they were foes of each other in the war, Shinn's kindness towards her is important in the two enemies becoming closer to one another. As I mentioned before, one of Shinn's main strengths is that he's an active character who is also kind and often chooses to lend a hand to help others, despite being complete strangers to them. In episode 21, on his day off, Shinn decides to spend it alone on the beach, observing the breeze as he relaxes his mind away from the duties of a soldier. As the lad enjoys the view, he notices Stella's innocence, dancing alongside the cliff. Shinn has a visibly calm expression and even smiles at her innocence, until Stella unknowingly falls off the cliff. Despite Shinn having no relations to her at this point in the story, he still decides to jump in many feet below to save the young girl he had only seen twice up into the story. Even though Shinn's kindness was crucial in rescuing her from drowning, Shinn, being Shinn, still has a pissy fit by calling her names and accidentally triggering her by saying if she wants to die. Stella, of course, is traumatized and scared from the fact that she could die at any moment. Shinn calms her down by vowing to her that he will protect her. Well, unlike the other characters Shinn has interacted so far, he seizes her, Stella, as another victim of war, just like how he is. Someone as innocent as her is damaged from the events of war, someone that connects with Shinn's experience. This moment is really where Shinn truly opens up to someone. His speaking tone is softer and much more kinder in order to not upset Stella. Now, at this point onwards, it's been established that the two have a connection of sorts. It's also implied in games and anime that Shinn sees his sister in Stella. Stella represents the innocence of Shinn's sister that reminds the boy of the good times he had, and because of this fragility and innocence of Stella, it urges Shinn to protect and even care for her. Fans can even notice how Stella is one of the few characters that Shinn actually apologizes to and even talks to in a light tone. In retrospect, Shinn sees her as someone that he must protect, someone that represents the innocence of his sister, and ultimately a pure individual that has been traumatized from war. Shinn sympathizes with her, which in turn causes him to care about someone else for a change. Even when Shinn sees her suffering aboard the Minerva, he is shocked and showed a lot of empathy towards her, something he has rarely done at this point of the story. He even disobeys military law on his own to save her on two separate occasions, despite knowing that he'll probably be executed for his actions. At the end of the day, the young lad truly sees Stella more than just a disposable lab rat or a tool. He sees her as a person innocent as his sister, a person with a desire to live, a desire to be free from the trauma of war. Having no choice, Shinn reluctantly delivers her to the enemy forces in hopes that she can live again and have a life free from war and pain, a life that Shinn very much could have envisioned his own sister having. This is why Shinn was so angry when Kira killed her. Not only did he fail Stella, but he failed to keep his vows and promises of not letting past tragedies repeat. His sister was a big part of his life, And so when someone who not only represents his sister, but also as a person who he connected to on a different level from his peers, it's only right that Shinn feels pissed for once again failing to protect what matters to him the most. In a sense, I guess you can say that Shinn is stuck in the past. Now, once again, I have to address fans' detest of Shinn for blaming the wrong person for Stella's death. Instead of blaming Kira for killing her, shouldn't Shinn be putting the blame on Neo for actually breaking his promises to keep her out of the war? Well, the thing is, Neo was actually shot down by Kira, so in Shinn's point of view, Neo is already good as dead. So who does Shinn blame in all of this? Kira, the closest person that Shinn could take out his anger out on. Another thing is, not only that, but in episode 38, A New Flag, Shinn is clearly taking out his anger on Logos and the Alliance as well. And judging from the voice actor's line delivery, we can clearly tell that Shinn is pissed off at the Alliance for turning Stella into a weapon of war. One last thing that I want to clear up is that fans believe Shinn was indirectly responsible for the innocents dying in Berlin by returning Stella to Neo, which of course allowed her to be the pilot of Destroy. Okay, first of all, in the next couple of episodes, episode 38 and 44 of the HD Remastered, it is evident that the Alliance has already produced quite a number of Destroy Gundams in their mainland base that were already ready for use. Jibril has already planned to destroy Berlin with his army. He had a bunch of destroyers laying around, so even if Stella wasn't going to be the pilot, there was still Sting and a couple more handful bunch that could easily get the job done by using the chaotic power of the Destroy. Anger is a powerful emotion. It is an emotion that our young hero can't control and has no way of dealing with it in a healthy way. Instead, the youngster just takes out his frustrations on the battlefield. Anger is just one of Shinn's many characteristics that makes up who he is. Judging from what I've been saying about Shinn the whole video, it's clear as day that Shinn is an immature kid that means well but has a lot to learn. Just like a kid, he is also impressionable, often following and trusting in the ideals of whom he finds admirable. The young lad himself also has a lot of grit behind all his anger. He often uses his power to risk his own life to save others in need. An act of courage and kindness. To summarize the Shinn of the first half of the story, he is someone who clearly defines orders and risks his own life to save others for what he thinks is the best decision. And he has a lot to prove. But beneath that rough exterior of anger, he actually has a much softer side to him that he doesn't really show much to his peers and allies. I do think that because Shinn is stuck in the past, he can't really show his true emotions or show his true self to others. That is why he's always pissed off or in an angry fit of rage. Standoffish, if you may. By this point in the story, we have already reached the second half of Seed Destiny, which is regarded as one of the worst time-wasting pieces of trash anyone has ever seen. Even someone like me, who enjoyed Seed Destiny, can tell you that the last 10 episodes or so aren't worth the time to care or even invest in. However, despite the last episodes having a lot of, let's just say, unnecessary filler, I do think that even if Shinn lost focus as the MC by this point, I do find certain parts of the second half to be crucial in his development. After giving the orders to shoot down Athrun and Mayrin, two of his allies who he personally knew, Shinn is noticeably disturbed by what has happened so far at this point of the story. He falters and is even shocked by everything that has happened so far. It is not until Mayrin's sister, Luna Maria, enters the room and cries to him, where Shinn finally opens up his fragility to her. He even apologizes to her and even takes responsibility for the events that unintentionally put his comrade in such emotional pain. This is something Shin of the first half would never do. Taking responsibility. He knows he has hurt one of his closest allies, and because of this, he allows himself to be a shoulder for her to cry on, and even show her a side of him that was never seen before. At this point in the story, Luna Maria is the second person that Shin has ever apologized to. It is noticeable that Shin cares for her enough to allow himself to be vulnerable to her, instead of being the same standoffish character of early Seed Destiny. Luna Maria's painful feelings have left an impression on Shin, and as a result, the two have formed a connection over the pain of having lost loved ones. Now I know what you guys are saying. Well, technically Shin did try to kill, her sister, and now she's trying to get with him. It kind of doesn't make sense, but for the sake of this essay, let's just say it works, okay? It's been established at this point that the two have common ground now, and as a result, starts to have romantic feelings for the other. Luna Maria no longer sees Shin as an immature teenager, but rather someone who has grown into a strong warrior. Meanwhile, the same can be said for Shin. He doesn't view Luna Maria anymore as a friend, but someone he can be vulnerable towards, someone he could show his softer side to. However, the same cannot be said to Rei, Shin's closest ally. Like I said before, Rei and even Durando exist in this story as an outside force that deflects responsibility from Shin's actions. One of the most egregious cases is how Durando pardoned Shin for breaking military law to save Stella. Earlier, I mentioned how Shin is an impressionable teenager and follows those who support his actions and are admirable in their traits. Durando is both of these things combined. If you take note of how every time the Minerva team meets up with Durando, the chairman always greets and praises Shin first for his battle record out of everyone in the group. Not only that, but Durando also gives Shin a platform to talk about his experiences of the past wars of Seed through one of the recap episodes. By having Shin voice his opinion on the past experience of the war during Seed, Durando is indirectly letting Shin know that he needs his support, and he needs Shin to be on his side so that the Destiny plan can work. This is why Durando tries to build a very healthy relationship with Shin to manipulate him into doing what he wants him to do. And if you take notice of Durando's body language in these episodes, he is very professional and very inviting towards his peers. Of course, hides a dark, manipulative side to him. Durando's manipulation of Shin was very apparent early on. From episode 12, it's revealed that Shin was made the pilot of the Impulse instead of Rei, who had better qualities than Shin. Shin was mainly picked to be the Impulse's pilot because of his genes and qualities. Even in episode 19 to 20, Durando notices Shin's great work on the battlefield and even gives him a chance to talk about his point of view of the war. And later on the second half of Destiny, Durando even promotes and gives the Destiny Gundam to Shin as a result of his great accomplishments. Durando is everything Shin expects from Athrun, someone who acknowledges his accomplishments and support his every action by praising his deeds, someone who's on his side, someone who always says yes to his ideals and actions. In a way, it is very much like Palpatine and Anakin from Star Wars. Rei also manipulates Shin into being Durando's best soldier by often dodging responsibility from Shin's shoulders and telling his ally that everything he does is right and correct. Rei and Durando have already left such a powerful impression on a young Shin, which proves how toxic and manipulative these two forces are. Due to these two factors of the two forces, Shin never really reflects upon his action, and as such, sways to Durando's side during the last episodes. Now, in the final segment of this video, I would like to explain the most controversial last 5 episodes of the Gundam anime ever. Shinn not joining the Three Ships Alliance. When Durando explained and unveiled the Destiny plan to the world, fans and even Morosawa expected Shinn to stand on his own feet and think for himself of what he should do instead of listening to Durando and Rei. Unlike the Shinn of the first half of Destiny, who was always defiant and did what he thought was right by defining orders and going off on his own to help others, this time the Shinn of the second half doesn't do this and is confused about the situation at hand. This situation is different from all the ones in the past. By joining the Three Ships Alliance and betraying Durando, not only is he betraying Zaf, but he is betraying his very comrades and loved one. It begs the question, what will happen to Luna Maria and all the allies he grew fond of and swore to protect under Minerva? What about the people of the plants? Unlike the beginning of the story, Shinn has responsibilities and connections now, being in the form of his allies and friends. He can't just magically switch sides in the last 3 episodes out of nowhere and just walk out on his allies. This is why Shinn was very confused, mirroring Athrun's time on the Minerva. Where does Shinn go from here? Does he go right, where nothing is left? Or does he go left, where nothing is right? Now, I do agree that Shinn could have maybe joined the Three Ships Alliance against Durando, but why would he at this point? The Three Ships Alliance was technically, actually no, they were responsible for letting Jibril get away and firing the Requiem beam cannon. Not only that, but they were allied with the remnants of the Alliance in the last few episodes. The same organization that turned the dude's ex-girlfriend into a mentally unstable war machine. Not only that, but it's also narratively poor writing to have Shinn switch out of nowhere in the last 3 episodes. It wouldn't really make sense. Just like almost every Gundam protagonist by the second half, Shinn at this point of the last episodes is at his lowest and mentally exhausted by everything that has happened so far. Because of this, he reluctantly accepts the Destiny plan despite not really agreeing with it in the inside. He just wants the war to end as soon as possible, and by following along Rei and Durando and this truth that they speak of, Shinn sees it as a way for everything to end. He just goes with it just to get everything over with because he is so tired of all the battles and sacrifices he has to face. In the final battle, Shinn was so distraught that he almost ended up killing his girlfriend just to get through Athrun. Athrun, of course, soundly defeats his former comrade in battle, saving Luna Maria in the progress. After the battle ends, Shinn was shown crying to Luna Maria, not because he failed to enact the Destiny plan, but because he was grateful that he didn't end up making a mistake that would have killed the only person closest to him. But instead, she was very clearly alive. Luna tells Shinn that orb was not destroyed. This time, instead of Shinn lending emotional support to his significant other, it is ultimately Luna who does so by embracing her boyfriend in her arms as they both cry together. This quote by Fukuda himself goes against what was shown in the epilogue and everything that I've been saying in this video essay so far. It's true that Shinn hasn't progressed or developed as much as we viewers and fans had hoped, but there is quite something about Shinn that actually does change. Remember how in the beginning of Seed Destiny and in my video essay that Shinn didn't really have friends or people that could understand him? Well, thanks to Bandai Visual for giving us the special editions in HD Remaster, there are scenes that ultimately proves Shinn is no longer alone as he was in the beginning of the story. He actually has friends now. Connections. Shinn is no longer the same person he once was. He has friends that can connect and even care for him. This, of course, being in the form of Athrun and Ludamaria, and maybe even Kira. When Kira and Shinn shook hands, it is a metaphor of Shinn putting his past troubles and vendettas all behind. It says a lot about his character. He's now choosing to forgive and letting people inside his circle instead of being rageful and standoffish. In retrospect, Shinn has matured in this very scene by letting go of his past. In conclusion, I do believe that Shinn represents the naive youth of today. The youth often want to have power to help and change the world in order to not repeat the mistakes of yesterday. In doing so helps create a better future. It is the good intentions of their will that causes them to go out of their way to help others despite the consequences. And as we learn these consequences, we learn that responsibility of our actions have on others. But being naive and young often leads to the manipulation of the media and higher-ups. To reflect, Shinn is not a bad character, nor is he a good one at that. He's plagued by bad writing, but that doesn't really stop him from being relatable and followable, just like us. Unlike the other two protagonists of this series, Shinn is very much human and relatable to almost everyone. I'm sure anyone who has ever been young like Shinn has at least experienced what he has gone through in this anime. I know I have, and because of this, I believe that Shinn is a relatable protagonist somewhat that feels very human. In the end, I know there were questionable writing choices that could cause a lot of people to hate him as a character, but I for one enjoy his relationships and dynamic characteristics with the cast. Shinn is honestly one of my favorite anime characters, and I'm not really asking or trying to change your minds if you hate or dislike him. I'm just simply trying to explain what I understand and view to be an underrated underdog and misinterpreted character. Okay, P.S. One last thing. I do know of the Super Robot Wars games doing Shinn's character better. I have played those games and enjoyed them a lot, but the reason I chose to omit mentioning the games from this video essay is because I wanted to mainly focus on how the anime and Morosawa portrays Shinn. Anyways, thank you guys for making it this far and listening to my views and opinions of what is one of my favorite anime characters of all time.